Hi, I'm Celebrity Bulletin. As you probably know, back in August, the Bleach manga made a comeback to the Shonen Jump magazine with a new special chapter in order to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the IP. In it there's a lot of interesting things, but without a doubt, the most exciting thing was the fact that Kubo has teased us with some of his ideas in regards to Hell, whom despite knowing its existence, we don't know pretty much anything about it canonically speaking. So today I'm gonna discuss everything we know about Hell, going into all the new information we have learned in the new chapter, and also we're gonna see the real canonicity of the 4th Bleach movie, The Hellverse, and how much involvement from Kubo actually had this movie. In this way I'm gonna suggest some theories based on what Kubo showed us in the chapter, some aspects of the movie, and some info from the novel Can't Fear Your Own World regarding Hell. Let's dive into the video! Well guys, I cannot believe a new chapter of the Bleach manga has been released in 2021, but here we are. So in short, the chapter itself not only serves as an introduction to a new arc about Hell, which is already exciting in and of itself, it also demonstrates Kubo's ability to bring back established concepts and give them a new coherent purpose, thus surprising the reader, and also offering a new side to all of those concepts while rereading all chapters. Also, the timeline of the story is set 12 years after the events of the 1000-year Blood War arc, and I love how Kubo brought us to date with the Shinigami, showing us how they have incorporated current technologies into the Soul Society, and leaving some comic relief moments and interesting interactions between new and already established characters. So to keep it short, I love the chapter. But before we get into the new stuff, let's briefly remember what a Hell is. Hell is a dimension or realm which stays apart from the three main realms, Soul Society, Hueco Mundo and the world of the living, and it existed way back before the creation of those three main domains by the Soul King, as stated by Ichibei in Can't Fear Your Own World. Now, Hell's main purpose is to give punishment to all souls who committed serious sins while they were humans, cause a Shinigami Sanpakuto only expies all the sins committed after a human has become a hollow, letting this hollow or a rancor soul to reincarnate into the Soul Society. However, if those sins were committed in their lifetime as humans, Hell will assure those souls end up trapped inside its realm, as we see with the Hollow Shrieker. Now, in this chapter, Kubo gives us new information about what actually happens when a hollow enters Hell. Turns out every hollow achieves to physically get rid of their hollow hole, which symbolizes their lack of heart or humanity, and thus their despair to fill that void eating human souls. And now all of this suffering and despair overflows from their brains, in Sailaporo's case manifesting horns which are pretty representative of his bond with Hell. That's pretty interesting, cause not only hollows stay attached to Hell via the chains of Hell in order to receive punishment, which by the way, those chains are now attached to a hollow's body and aren't physical chains as we see in the movie, even though we see that those physical chains actually appeared in the chapter, but they seem like they are made of this new Reisai from Hell, which I'm gonna talk about later. As I was saying, hollows aren't only attached to Hell in order to receive punishment, they also achieve to get rid of this hatred and suffering derived from his hollow hole. And now those feelings manifest so intensely in their brains that they overflow, manifesting physical changes. Thereby, a hollow, as we see with Sailaporo, transforms into a being whose only purpose is to consciously inflict hatred and pain onto others, thus transforming those hollows from Hell into mercilessly demons called Preachers from Hell or Jigoku no Gaki. But that's not all. Kubo also mentions another exception from which a soul can end up in Hell. Shunsui tells us a Shinigami's body is composed of spirit particles or Reisai, and when a Shinigami perishes, his body returns to the soil of the Soul Society, something we already know. But it turns out there is a term called Rei or Spirit Class. This term was only used by the aristocrats of the Soul Society in the past, and it measures the density of spiritual pressure or Reiatsu within spirit particles or Reishi. A common Shinigami possesses Reishi of 20th class, a lieutenant around 5th or 4th class, and all the Shinigami of 3rd class are captains. The problem is, a captain's Reiatsu is too dense to return with the rest of the Reishi, which forms the soil of the Soul Society. In the Shinigami Academy, it teaches a solution to this problem via performing a ritual called Soul Burial Celebration Ritual, or Konsō Reisai. In essence, this ritual is the same as the Soul Burial or Konsō. The difference relies on, instead of purifying pluses or hollows, the main objective is to downgrade the spiritual presence density of a captain's spirit particles, thus allowing his soul to rest in peace while returning his spiritual body to the soil of Soul Society. This ritual is pretty simple. It only consists in killing a hollow, captured by the lieutenants, in front of the grave of a captain 12 years after passing away. The chapter mentions Yamamoto and Unohana's ritual has been completed recently, and now it's Yujiro Ukitake's turn. However, while Ukitake's ritual was taking place, it suddenly appeared some kind of Reishi-esque particles from hell. Those, as Shunsui comments, are called Jigoku no Rinki, or phosphoric air from hell. That's the literal translation though. This translation does refer to them as phosphoplasm from hell, while a fan translation made by TCP Scans refers to them as Will-O-Wisp from hell. So take whatever name you feel is the most accurate. The thing is, those particles from hell seem pretty similar to the yellow liquid seen in the movie, cause both of them seem to coercively interact with their environment, giving a possible answer to why Sairaporo's arm is consumed to the bones while it's covered with Jigoku no Rinki, cause in the movie we can see burns caused by this yellowish matter, and also we can see how this yellowish matter is present in Hell's atmosphere. So this phosphoric air from Hell could be represented in a similar fashion to this yellowish liquid or atmosphere when Kubo decides to show us how Hell looks in the manga. Turning back to Ukitake's ritual and the appearance of this phosphoric air from Hell around the grave of Ukitake, this event allows Shunsui to reveal to us the truth about this ritual. He explains there's an old tale which says, all the 3rd class Reishi can't return in any way or form into the Soul Society, and in reality this ritual is made in order to send those captains to Hell. That's a pretty interesting new concept, and it shows us how the Shinigami have found a way to allow captains to return somewhere while maintaining the balance between the 3 realms of the Soul King. However, without them realizing, they condemned all of those captains to stay in Hell, and this succession of rituals, which all of them transferred to Hell 3 captains with pretty dense Reiatsu consecutively, has caused the destabilization of Hell, a dimension where the Shinigami doesn't have any authority, and now Hell is forced to invade other domains in order to balance itself. To put it simply, Soul Society has condemned his own domain, Hueco and the world of the living to be forcefully invaded by Hell. Still, this Soul Society's era isn't the only factor which caused the invasion of Hell into one of the Soul King's domains. Sairaporo tells us this disbalance not only occurs due to sending large amounts of powerful Reiatsu into Hell. The other reason why the Moss of Hell opened is Aizen's and Yuhabak's Reiatsu disappearance, which kept the Moss of Hell shut until now. But the fact of not having their spiritual pressure around anymore and sending large amounts of dense Reiatsu into Hell caused the Jaws of Hell's appearance, which are those Garganta-like portals connecting with Hell. For the time being, that's all the new information we know without the necessity of theorizing or speculating anything. Now, even though I've already commented on some similarities between the movie and the chapter, in order to speculate more about Hell and thus theorize about all the new information left by Kubo in the chapter, we're gonna know how much of an involvement there's in the Hellverse movie from Kubo himself. To do so, I'm gonna use as reference an interview made to Masashi Kuro, who worked on the Bleach anime as character designer and key animator, on the official introductory book of the movie called Bleach Official Invitation Book, The Hellverse. And also I'm gonna use as reference a letter from Kubo, which can be found on the original DVD exclusive edition of the movie. Be aware the translation of the interview is a bit ambiguous, cause I don't know Japanese and Google does its best, but thanks to the fact that I've studied animation and the translation can be understood, I've resumed the most important data found in the interview. With that said, let's see what happened between Kubo and the production team of the movie. First, you have to know, Kudo was in charge of the character designs, conceptually designed Hell, being the chief animation director and key animator, and also made the 2 key visuals of the movie. Now, about the concept of hell, Kudo says 1 year in advance from the movie premiere in 2010, Tite Kubo said he didn't have any plans of drawing hell in the manga, and Kudo showed him his still primitive concept about hell. Tite Kubo's response about this concept was positive and said he liked it, and thus Kudo received the green light to use this concept for the movie. However, even though the team used this concept from Kudo, the final aesthetic of hell was decided as the storyboards were made by the directors, in order to nail the aesthetic of hell depending on the staging of the screenplay to enhance and give more richness to each shot of the movie. Now, somewhere around 2009, Kubo comments he had a meeting with the scriptwriter of the movie. In it, Kubo assures they had come up with pretty interesting ideas, and also mentioned the scriptwriter had taken notes on all of those ideas. However, even though Kubo expected the scenario for the movie to come out by winter, he received it for the first time in spring of 2010, and it didn't include any of those ideas Kubo came up with the scriptwriter. But before I continue, I want to address what Kubo refers to when says a scenario. So, when Kubo refers to a scenario, he's talking about what is known outside Japan as the screenplay. In it, it's exposed all the content of the movie alongside all the necessary information to produce it, including dialogue, localizations, descriptions, etc. However, the Japanese version of the screenplay known as scenario doesn't include any information in regards to how each shot will be framed in the movie. That's decided by the staff in charge of the storyboards. The thing is, when Kubo says none of his ideas were in this scenario, he means none of the ideas developed alongside the scriptwriter were included in this script. Apparently, those notes made by the scriptwriter weren't communicated to the director Noriyuki Abe nor the rest of the staff members, and even though the scriptwriter had problems with the production department in order to include the ideas discussed with Kubo, it was too late. Still, Kubo designed the Sinners or Togabito and the Wardens of Hell or Kushanāda based on the existing script. Those designs were adapted for animation by Masashi Kudo, and he also was in charge of characterizing those characters, going so far as redesigning Shuren, cause Kubo didn't specify who would be the leader of this group of sinners, so Kudo tried to give Shuren a more leadership appearance. And fun fact, if you are an Orihime fan, Kudo was responsible for changing Orihime's outfit, adding in those tights as his whim. So go to his Twitter page and thank him if you like this fanservice. Anyway, the conclusion is Kubo did actually like the concept of hell made by Kudo presented in the movie, so maybe in the future we could see some of those ideas reimagined by Kubo in the manga. So in order to theorize more about the remaining information left by Kubo in the chapter, I'm gonna relate some concepts presented in the movie with what we have seen in the manga, thus theorizing and opening debate. The first direct relation we see in the chapter are the Hell portals and the existence of the Wardens of Hell acknowledged by Sailaporo. Regarding the portals or jaws of Hell, there aren't lots of differences between the ones we saw in the movie. Sail appears from a jaw of Hell with a similar shape and both showcase the chains of Hell. The most relevant difference is the implementation of blue fire instead of teeth, which may be a reference to the will-o-wisp appearing in graveyards, caused by the ignition of materials such as phosphorus or methane, because the movie shows us the existence of a graveyard of sinners into the depths of hell, where the flames of hell burn all the sinners' corpses once their souls are finally crushed due to the eternal torture applied by the Wardens of Hell or Kushanāda. And speaking of them, we have seen only one of them so far in the canon material, so we are gonna see how they are with the information currently available. The Wardens of Hell or Kushanādas are beings which inhabit Hell, and their main purpose is monitoring Hell while making sure all sinners receive their deserved punishment until their souls are crushed, thus destroying or purifying in a way those souls. And they are also in charge of finding those sinner souls in the human world, or while they are on their way to the Soul Society and make sure they receive their deserved punishment. Wait, don't you think those duties seem pretty similar to those of a Shinigami? I mean, both are in charge of the management of souls in their respective domains, and they also look out for souls in order to send them to their dimensions. And even more, they both use their swords to purify or condemn souls and thus send them to their respective domain. And in the chapter, we see Ukitake fulfilling a Warden's duty a few moments after he has been sent into Hell, and does it while using his Sanpakuto, which is shown in a wider scale. like the Kushanāda swords. Therefore, the first and most evident theory is that the Wardens of Hell were Shinigamis all along, who were at least ranked as captains. And if this is true, it means those Shinigami will change their appearance when entering Hell too. I don't know, imagine Yamamoto taking the appearance of a Kushanāda. This opens a wide variety of possibilities to Kubo to be super creative if he decides to show us some redesigned characters. And not only that, there's a perfect excuse to present us some old Shinigami we haven't seen before, like the proper introduction of the original captains of the first Gotei 13 alongside Yamamoto and Urahara. The possibilities are endless, and if this theory ends up being true, it's going to be interesting to see how Kubo treats the Wardens of Hell. They will be immortal, or they could be destroyed and reborn like sinners do in the depths of Hell. And if they didn't revive, the Wardens of Hell will have their own grave and thus be allowed to rest their souls in Hell? And that would be possible without causing an imbalance of the three realms of the Soul King? A lot of doubts and few answers for sure. But the theories don't stop there. The chapter left us some more data to keep theorizing upon them. For example, Sayel tells us the Wardens of Hell are clairvoyants, implying they are aware of everything occurring in other dimensions. And also he tells us if we know why the Hell butterflies used by the Shinigami contain Hell in their name. And as we know, names in Bleach determine the power of every existing thing, meaning something with no name doesn't have any power. So, I think the concept of clairvoyance and the Hell butterflies are completely related. Let me explain. The Hell butterflies or Jigokucho have two main purposes. First, they allow you to send messages or share relevant information to any Shinigami instantly. That's possible because exists a connection between the Hell butterflies, which allows them to send messages from an emissary butterfly to a receptor one. And second, they allow any spiritual being to travel from one dimension to another one instantly, while guiding them on their journey throughout dimensions. As an example, we have the fact that the Jigokucho allows Shinigami to directly travel from the opening to the exit of a Senkaimon gate without the need of crossing over the Dangai, leading me to believe the Hell butterflies can create small portals to evade crossing through the Dangai. And if this is true, this will explain what happens with Rukia in chapter 1. In it we can see a Hell butterfly guiding Rukia, in order to find her target, Fishbone D. And in a mere instant Rukia appears in Ichigo's room throughout a small black portal, which seems more suitable for a Hell butterfly than Rukia due to its small size. And we also see the appearance of a second Jigokucho alongside another small black portal when Rukia performs the Soul Funeral or Konsō. So, as we see with the Shinigami, we can assume the Hell butterflies are in charge of transporting and guiding souls, like pluses or wolves, from the world of the living to the Soul Society. Then, so far, we know the Jigokucho are spiritual beings, cause it's implied they cannot be seen by any human, unless their souls have some level of control over the spiritual energy, like the Shinigami. And we also know the Hell butterflies, apart from serving as a communication device, they can move on their own while guiding souls across dimensions or guiding Shinigamis throughout the Senkaimon gates, as well as guiding them to their target. And in this new chapter we can see the appearance of Hell butterflies every time a Jaw of Hell opens, and we even see them appearing when the gates of Hell open in order to bring back Sayel pouring into Hell. So my theory is, the Jigokucho originated from Hell and they are used to guide the Wardens of Hell in their job of finding sinner souls or Togabito. And as well as the Senkaimon gates, the Hell butterflies allow a Warden's arm to be transported from the entry to the exit of the gates of Hell whenever the exit of those gates opens, thus allowing the Wardens of Hell to condemn sinner souls while transporting those souls to Hell from another dimension. And there's even more. If we take into account the Hell butterflies have the ability of sharing information, it wouldn't be strange if the Warden's clairvoyance is thanks to the Hell butterflies, cause if they can communicate with each other regardless of the dimension in which they are located, they could be sharing information between them and the Hell butterflies residing in Hell, thus keeping the Wardens of Hell informed of everything occurring in other dimensions. Now, why are the Shinigami in possession of the Jigokucho? And why would those butterflies have their origin in Hell? In order to answer those questions, we have to briefly go back to the birth of the three main domains of Bleach, according to what Ichibe tells us in the novel Can't Fear Your Own Word. If you want a detailed video about the primordial world of Bleach, let me know in the comments. But in the video's favor, I'm gonna try to go straight to the point in order to give you the necessary context in order to understand Hell's origins. In resume, Ichibe says, "In the beginning, there weren't various dimensions. It only exists one chaotic world where neither life nor death were a thing. In it, there wasn't any established balance. Everything balanced indefinitely from one way onto another. The world remained in this state for around 100 million years. At some point of this ever-changing balance, a pit originated. This pit would be later become known as Hell. At this point, it's hard to say if Hell played any role, cause at this time, even becoming a hollow was part of the circulation of spirit particles or Reisai. However, eventually, the hollows started to devour human souls, and in order to evade the stagnation of the circulation of Reisai, caused by the fact that every soul in existence will become part of a gigantic menace, a life form with the ability of killing hollows and powers that border the divinity, the omniscience and the omnipotence was born, thus saving the world. Around the same time, other powerful life forms were born. Alongside them, the founders of the 5 great noble families. They didn't agree with the actual world established by this almost divine life form, which maintained the world out of stagnation by exterminating hollows, and thus their souls, from existence. And so, those 5 individuals group up in order to discuss how they will change the world with the help of this almost divine individual, which later will be known as the Soul King. The thing is, everyone gives their opinion, but there's one of them, which is the ancestor of the only unknown noble family yet, that said, "I think a lead is needed in order to cover the pit," implying his will to isolate Hell from what will later be known as the 3 main realms of the Soul King. So there isn't much room to interpret from this sentence, but what's clear is his will to isolate Hell at any cost. Maybe it has to do with Hell's nature. I mean, the novel doesn't tell us how this pit is formed in the first place, but what's for sure is that Hell must represent some kind of danger or discomfort for the creation of the 3 main realms of the Soul King, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to seal Hell. So here's the approach of my theory. Ichibe says that in the primordial world there was a shifting balance, swinging back and forth. So, if a balance exists, it means a cycle of reincarnation capable of maintaining the infinite circulation of Reisai will have to exist. This is the actual cycle of reincarnation we know. A human dies, his spirit composed of Reisai is no longer tied to his chain of fate, and it's purified and sent to the Soul Society. When this soul dies again, his spiritual body returns to the soil of the Soul Society, while his soul is reincarnated in the human world, thus tying up this cycle. However, this cycle couldn't occur just like that in the primordial world, because there weren't any different dimensions to begin with. And both Reisai and Kishi, the latter being the matter that composes everything in the world of the living, will have to exist in the same plane or dimension. So at that point, there shouldn't be an established cycle. But if we remember, Ichibe said that at some point of this shifting balance, a pit was formed. And also, after this pit was formed, the process of becoming a hollow was part of the natural circulation of Reisai. That is to say, it was part of an established cycle. So here's my theory. After the world establishes this cycle after the formation of the pit, it would look like this, taking as reference the design of Hell in the movie, cause at that time, everything was part of the same dimension. And as we see, the structure of Hell presented in the film seems to be structured in layers. Something that would perfectly represent a world where everything is in the same dimension. And I think this pit known as Hell in the future was formed naturally by the world itself to assure the infinite circulation of Reisai, creating a place where souls could reincarnate, thus closing an infinite cycle. As it happens with the Soul King's birth, this being a life form born out of the rejection of the world to end up stagnated and thus coming to an end. And I specifically believe that the pit or Hell's main purpose was to reincarnate souls, because in the movie we can see how this dimension can revive every existing soul in his realm. And not only that, they also tell us that those endlessly revived souls end up collapsing, and the only thing remaining is their spiritual bodies, which are burnt out by the flames of Hell, only leaving his bones and ashes. This cycle is pretty fitting for Hell, but remember that this place is sealed in the present time due to the 5 leaders' will of the noble families, but in its origins it was an open pit. So, the fact that they sealed it tells me that this pit was capable of reincarnating souls into the material surface, or Kishi surface, when those souls died in the pit. However, due to the Soul King's birth and his ability to exterminate hollows and thus their souls, an imbalance of souls occurs in the world, thus making it impossible to sustain the reincarnation cycle of the pit in the long term, if hollow souls are continuously being eradicated from existence. And in order to avoid this, the 5 leaders of the noble families alongside the Soul King decide to create their own cycle of reincarnation, establishing in this way a less shifting and proportionate balance of souls. In order to do this, they will have to seal the world's natural source of reincarnation, thus explaining why all souls are condemned to infinitely reborn in hell. And even in the prologue of the movie drawn by Tite Kubo, a special emphasis is put on the fact that the gates of hell won't ever be opened, perhaps referring to the fact that hell was sealed and isolated in order to establish a new reincarnation cycle made by the Soul King and the leaders of the 5 great noble families. So, if this theory ends up being correct, we know that after hell was formed, the world was able to establish a reincarnation cycle, and at a later date, this cycle was replaced by the cycle created by the first Shinigami and the Soul King, thanks to sealing the reincarnation cycle of the pit, thus condemning all the souls who end up in hell to be cyclically reborn, leaving those souls infinitely trapped in this dimension. This theory will also explain why Sael is visually represented as an angel, because all the hollows who entered hell at that time would be the equivalent of the current Shinigami, because the Soul Society is what is considered in Bleach as heaven. But if this theory is correct, the pit or hell would have been heaven at that primordial time before the creation of the 3 realms of the Soul King. This approach about hell being the equivalent of the Soul Society in the past fits pretty well into everything I said, but the first person who thought of this possibility was a Japanese Twitter user named saigozudon, where he comes up with some interesting ideas, like the fact of why the Shinigami, which are literally called the gods of death, are residing in a supposed heaven. And he also suggests whether the Quincy powers of the Soul King and his birth were created by the residents of the pit or hell, because the Quincies are visually represented as angels in the story. If you want to settle your own conclusions, I linked his tweets in the description of the video. And I also linked a video made by DBZimran, who most of you will already know, in which he explains this theory in relation to those tweets and also explains everything about hell. So if you haven't seen this video, it's a must see for any Bleach fan. Well, going back to the subject, if the pit or hell was in charge of the reincarnation cycle in the past, it doesn't necessarily imply it wouldn't be done in the same way as the Soul Society does. A soul reincarnates in the world of the living after passing away or spending a large period of time in the Soul Society. But keep in mind the Soul Society is made of Reisai, and in the new chapter it's implied that hell is formed by its own variation of Reisai called Jigoku no Rinki or phosphorus air from hell. If we assume this matter is an equivalent of the yellowish matter of the movie, as I proposed before, we can think about some interesting ideas. In the movie, it's stated by Renji that the atmosphere of hell is somehow poisonous to spiritual entities made of Reisai, and as we can see, the phosphorus air and this yellowish matter seem to corrosively react when entering in contact with their environment. In Jigoku no Rinki's case, it seems to corrosively react to any entity made of Reisai. Something similar occurs with the Koryu, the torrent of matter which forms the walls of the Dangai, which traps spiritual entities and makes them stay forever in the Dangai, implying that due to time being much denser in the Dangai, a soul would eventually die faster in relation to other dimensions with a normal flow of time, thus explaining why there's only skeletons and bones inside the Dangai. But the Reisai which form a spiritual body couldn't have returned to the Soul Society, because when the Kototsu sweeps you away, your spiritual body alongside your soul are thrown off their time axis, causing an accelerated rejuvenation or aging of the spiritual body based on how far the Kototsu throws you off your time axis. So this Reisai that made up the body of a soul is probably absorbed by the Koryu or the Kototsu, or at worst eradicated from existence. So I wouldn't be surprised if hell could be capable of exterminating a soul's spiritual body made of Reisai as well, as the movie implies when it tells us the flames of hell burn out the spiritual bodies of the collapsed souls of sinners. Therefore, I think the hollows who entered into the pit not only became predators of hell, I also think that the phosphorus air will deteriorate their spiritual bodies, in order to reincarnate their souls and thus comply with the infinite cycle of reincarnation of the world. And if this theory ends up being correct, I will dare to say the mouths of the Chain of Fate are formed of this Reisai from Hell or Jigoku no Rinki, cause we already know the process of becoming a hollow already exists way back after the pit or hell was formed, so we can assume the Chain of Fate already existed back then. And when it's shown to us the process of becoming a hollow, Urahara mentions that the chain not only will eat itself, those mouths of the chain will prioritize eating a spiritual body if they enter in contact with it. The same way the Jigoku no Rinki will be in charge of destroying or devouring spiritual bodies, as we theorized it before. And also, apart from those mouths prioritizing spiritual bodies made of Reisai to eat, Kubo decides to show us the dynamics of those mouths and the Chain of Fate in a pit or shaft, creating an interesting parallelism with Hell, which in his origin was an opened pit. As if Kubo is hinting us that indeed those mouths are made of Jigoku no Rinki in order to comply with the reincarnation cycle of the pit or hell explained earlier. And if this phosphorus air from hell was in charge of eliminating spiritual bodies made of Reisai in order to fulfill the reincarnation cycle, this would explain why the Konsō Reisai was created by the first Shinigami in the first place, in order to send Reisai, which due to its high density can return to the soil of the Soul Society, letting Hell in charge of exterminating this Reisai with the passage of time, giving an actual explanation to the graves of Wardens seen in the movie, which in case Kubo implements this idea, they will be the graves of all the captains sent into Hell. And also, by sending to Hell those powerful souls, whose body can return to the soil of Soul Society due to their bodies being formed of dense Reisai, the Shinigami are sure to maintain the sinner souls out of Soul Society, cause the Wardens who determine if a soul is worthy of punishment in Hell or go to the Soul Society are captains of the Gotei 13 or Shinigamis with high spiritual density in their bodies. However, when a large amount of dense Reisai is sent to Hell, as we have seen in the new chapter, the gates of Hell have been able to get rid of the seals made by the ancestor of the Shinigami, and now Hell is forced to invade other dimensions in order to balance itself due to the large amounts of Reisai accumulated in this dimension. With all of that said, I'm gonna try to explain why I think the Hell Butterflies had their origin in Hell. The first noticeable relation between Hell and the Hell Butterflies, apart from their name, is the Dangai. As I said earlier, if the phosphorus air of Hell ends up being capable of exterminating spiritual bodies, a suspicious resemblance between Koryu and Jigoku no Rinki is generated, and Kubo even drew the soil of the Dangai and the visible Garganta from this dimension alongside the main characters of the Hellverse movie in a promotional illustration. So I dare to say that the fact of both reacting in a similar fashion to anything formed by Reisai, it's because the Dangai could have been created by the first Shinigami and the Soul King, taking as base the matter or Reisai of Hell when it was still an open pit. And in the first chapter of the manga as well as in the filler arc of Inaba Kagerosa, it can be interpreted that the Hell Butterflies also allowed to cross through the Dangai without the Koryu being activated, somehow hiding the spiritual presence of the Shinigami to Koryu or restricting the Koryu's reaction to spiritual entities as can be interpreted in this scene from episode 317 of the Bleach anime. So I don't have any doubts about saying the Hell Butterflies belong to Hell, and they allow you to cross the Dangai safely cause the Koryu was supposedly created in the likeness of the matter or Reisai from Hell. Now, when the Hell Butterflies were born? Well, if Hell really was in charge of reincarnating souls, the Hell Butterflies were probably born to transport those souls into the Kishi surface in order to complete the reincarnation cycle, in a similar fashion to how the Shinigami transport a purified soul from the world of the living into the Soul Society, thus explaining why the Hell Butterflies started to appear throughout the Jaws of Hell or the Gates of Hell when the Seals of Hell broke up. So if the Hell Butterflies come up from Hell, why are they in possession of the Shinigami? Well, if we take as reference everything I explained before, the leaders of the 5 noble families will probably know about the existence of those butterflies, and surely when they were to create a new reincarnation cycle for their new world, they probably captured the butterflies in order to transport souls between different dimensions, and we could assume the Shinigami bred them in order to dispose of them at any time, Cause in the Soul Society arc, there's a brief instance where it's talked about the Hell Butterflies, and it's shown how a low-ranked Shinigami is taking care of the butterflies, when suddenly one of them escapes and the Shinigami tries to bring her back using a false butterfly from the opposite gender. So we can speculate the Shinigami bred them in order to use them whenever they want. With all of this said, I'm gonna stop theorizing, cause otherwise I could be endlessly rambling upon all the information available in this new chapter. I know Kasui hasn't been brought up in this video, but Ichigo's son does leave too much window to speculate on their own, so I will talk about him at some point. If you would like to see a video on Kasui or about how it was the primordial world in Bleach in detail, let me know in the comment section. And if you have in mind some topics which could be interesting to discuss, please leave it in the comment section as well. Finally, thank you for watching. Give a thumbs up and subscribe if you like this content, and don't forget to press the bell to receive a notification every time I upload new content. I remind you to go over my Twitter if you wanna be informed about the latest updates about my videos, and I will see you soon. Bye!